Hi, welcome to the HomeBrew. So this is going to be an ongoing series of videos on tutorials on how to build guitars at home. In this first video, we're going to go ahead and answer one of the questions that I get asked the most on this channel, which is how to remove paint and lacquer off of an old guitar. So this is my method on doing things. I've tried a couple of different ways of doing it, and this is the way that I've found to be the best, easiest, and straight up anybody could do it, even from home, as long as you have proper extraction so you don't get dust all over the place. Safety first, guys. Without further ado, let's have at it. Alright, so straight off the bat, I'm going to pause the video right here. I know that I just said that this is about building guitars at home, and I know what you're thinking. This doesn't look like I'm at home. No, I am in fact at a workshop. Ta-da. But this is merely just to illustrate the point of how to go about taking off all the paint on a guitar. You can just as easily do this by hand without any power tools or anything like that, as long as you're in a place where you have good extraction. So, for instance, like your balcony or somewhere in your yard or something like that, a garage or something like that. Now, you can do everything I'm about to do, you can do by hand and sand by hand. It's just going to take longer. Because I'm on a schedule, I'm going to rent time at a workshop and do this with an orbital sander. But the process is exactly the same. So, let's move onwards. First up, I'm just going to take some 80 grit because I could go 100, 120. Once again, it's just going to take a hell of a lot longer. Using 80 grit, I'm sure to just get rid of all that stuff. All of the lacquer, all of the paint, everything very quickly. Things to note. Kind of let the sandpaper do most of the work. Use a sanding block if you can, and if you have one. If you don't have one, you can just as easily make one. It's just like a block of wood or something like that will work just fine. This is a carved top, so I'm having to be very careful. I'm not applying almost any pressure at all. And here I am illustrating the difference in what you're looking for. So on the very right, you have the bare wood, which is what you're aiming to. And in between that and the paint, there's the sealer coat. Back in the olden days when I first started off, I didn't know to recognize sealer coats. So some of my first paint jobs were kind of awful because I did not get rid of all that sealer or resin in the wood. So be very sure they actually get all the way down to the wood. And also wear a mask. But there will be a definite difference in the type of dust you're making, and there will be a definite difference in the type of smell in the room at that point, because sanding off lacquer and stuff like that gives off a rather nasty smell. So doing the same thing on the back, it's just fairly straightforward. Let the sandpaper do most of the work. Don't apply too much pressure and keep yourself moving. If you're using an orbital sander like I am, just keep the sander moving at all times so you don't create any sort of divots. Don't use the corners because that means that you're just digging into the wood. Use the entire pad. And yeah, make your way around the guitar. Just be careful with edges of pickup cavities and bridge cavities and control cavities and stuff like that, because they will tear your paper to shreds if you're doing this with sander, that is. Now when it comes to the belly carve, I am ever so slightly, I'm just using the weight of the machine itself, not putting any pressure. I'm letting the sandpaper do the work, and I'm using the corner of a soft pad, kind of brushing over the area, as it were. So I'm not digging into it, I'm just kind of moving the sandpaper over. This, of course, is a lot easier if you're doing it by hand because you're using a block, hopefully, or a folded up piece of sandpaper. So fold your sandpaper, people. That's very important. You kind of need to make a tool out of it, so fold it twice so that you have the sandpaper in 3 layers. This makes it a little bit more sturdy for this type of work. And with the edges as well, very easy by hand if you're using a block, so you keep everything square. If you're using a sander like I am, just be very certain that you're keeping your sander exactly square to the edge. And here again in the curves, I should say, applying the same sort of technique I did with the belly carve. So little by little, kind of brushing over the area from both sides so I don't create any divots, and make sure that immediately when I go past the sealer coat, I stop. I don't want to take away too much material. 80 grit is really rough and it will take away material very quickly, so just be careful. Now with the neck, it's a little bit of a different process. The headstock you can just easily do the same way you would do with the body because it's a flat area on both sides. But then when it gets to the actual neck itself, that's where it becomes a little bit more interesting if you're using a sander. Now, I should point out that I've tried multiple different ways of removing paint and lacquer. I started off with sanding in my parents' backyard, and then I moved on to using a heat gun and a paint scrape to do that same job. But that's always difficult because the heat gun scorched the wood at points, or the paint scrape would kind of damage and going to 120 now, or the paint scrape would do some damage to the wood. So okay, so we're moving on to the neck. Here I'm showing that I had the sander at maximum speed at 6, and now I put it down to 2. So because the neck, without a doubt, it's the control surface of your guitar, and it's what you're always in contact with. You don't want to change the shape at all. So to ensure that, I put the machine on a very low setting so I have better control over what it's doing, and slowly moving the sander around the neck, and once again letting the paper do all the work. So as I'm sanding, I'm rotating the neck at the same time, so I'm keeping everything moving so I don't change the shape of the neck whatsoever. But yeah, as I was saying, it's like I have tried different methods, but by far, sanding down lacquer and paint is the easiest and safest way of doing things. Using a heat gun as well, you give off so many toxic fumes that it's very unpleasant. You need to do that in an extremely well ventilated area, which a lot of households don't actually have unless you're doing it outside. Sanding's just easier. Sure, you create a lot of dust, but if you do it in a place where you can extract that dust, you should be just fine. So with 120 and all the sandpapers to come, what you're basically doing is removing all the scratches left over from the previous grit and basically flattening your surface. 80 grit will leave a lot of grooves in the wood, so 120 will get rid of that. It is a very long process, but it's well worth doing. After the 120, move on to 180. The manner in which you want to do this is 80 is just to get rid of all the lacquer and paint. 120 is to get rid of all the scratches left over from the 180 and give you a good surface to work with. Then, 120, sorry. Then 180, 240, and 320 is just to sand down to, you know, a good enough surface for you to work on getting your new finish on. Because you want your surface to be as smooth as possible and as scratch free as possible. You can go further than that, but there really is no point to it. I will explain later on what I do in the process that helps you give a really good finish. But overall, the main things you need to know is 80, 120, 180, 240, and 320. That is the basis of getting your guitar fine sanded. It's just repeating the same process over and over. If you see that there are any scratches left over, for instance, now during 180, if I notice that I've sanded the entire guitar down and there are still some scratches left over, that's more than likely left over from either the 80 or the 120. So I go back to 120 and sand those parts down again. And the guitar neck is a hell of a lot easier to actually sand down by hand because you don't need to worry about changing the shape all that much because you can let your fingers and the sandpaper follow that curve. Alright, so welcome to the next part of actually refinishing a guitar or removing paint. We're in different scenery, as you can see. Now we're in a lovely New York. Overview of my little... Once you've removed all the old lacquer and paint with either sanding by hand or orbital sander if you have one, or some sort of tool to use. What you didn't see was me sanding through or sanding away all the paint at the cutaways. That was due to the fact that there was no functioning bobbin sander at the workshop, and that is by far the easiest way to do it. Instead, I had to do it by hand, which was tedious and you can imagine lots of fun. That doesn't differ at all from how you remove everything else, so we're moving on to the next point. I have now sanded the guitar to 320, and what we're going to do next is wet the grain, or wet the wood. So that's going to raise all the grain up, then you move on to sanding away all that grain, all that raised grain. And you keep on doing that over and over up until the grain doesn't raise anymore. So, just water, basically. You don't need to drench the guitar. Just wet it enough so it's consistent all over. What this also does is show you if you had a lacquer on this, for example, it'll show you all the spots you've missed, where you'll clearly see what you would need to sand more. In my case, because I've put resin that I can't sand away, you'll see that through. Another thing that the water will reveal is scratches from all of your sanding. Scratches that need to be taken care of. Once again, in my case, fortunately this is my personal guitar, so I'm not all that fussed about it, but I will get out the most of things. So I don't know how well the camera picks up, but there's some rather big scratches right there, so I need to go pretty far back to get those out. I'm pretty sure that those came from me trying to get rid of all the resin, and I used a rasp, which then ended up scratching up the guitar, which is not cool.
And then there's a bunch of scratches there those are 180 scratches. Those could be 60 scratches as well. And just take a look over and see if there are any spots that you have missed. Spots that need more detail. Or spots that need more attention, I was meant to say. Okay, so I've managed to get rid of most of my scratches. So it's just that one I need to get rid of and a little bit over there. Just gonna put that to dry there for the time being. And then the neck. Now, you want to do this as many times as you can up until the grain doesn't raise all that much anymore. Just so that the next finish that you put on, whether that be oil, stain, paint, lacquer, anything, this is a crucial stage to do because it will ensure a much better finish in the end. Alright, I'm going to let those dry and we'll continue in a bit. Alrighty, so everything is dried up nicely and the grain has raised quite a bit. For the majority, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to go 240 then 320. To get the scratches out, I'll go to 180 and then work my way up to 320. Again, the neck is fine, so that's just going to need, by the looks of it, I might actually just go 320 with the neck, which is all good. Alright, so I'm going to get going on that. And okay, before you guys ask, these divots are a pain in the ass to sand. Because this is my guitar, I don't really care because I'm going to be painting those divots anyways. So to me it seemed like I was going to go through way too much effort for something that minuscule on my own personal guitar. I will preface that many times over. On any other guitar, I would definitely do that. I have a guitar that I'm actually doing that on, so there will be video of me doing it properly on that guitar. On this one, I just don't care enough to do so because it is my guitar, which is really funny. I care a lot less about my own personal guitars than the guitars that go out to go. Actually, that makes more sense. Yeah, guitars that go for sale, guitars that go for customers, I'm a freaking perfectionist about and will not let them go with the smallest scratch on them. This, however, it's based on a Harley Benton, and there's already it's an experimental guitar, so it'll remain an experiment. So now I'm just gonna time lapse the hell out of this thing. So. I have now wet the grain twice and sanded everything nicely. The neck is still a bit wet, but by the looks of it, the grain is not raising that much more than what it was earlier. So I'm gonna have a look if I only need to sand it one more time. If I only need to sand it once over, then I'm gonna go to 320 again. So build my way up. I'm gonna go 240 then 320. But I'm gonna do the last bit with 400. Just because that'll give me a really good place to continue from. So, still gonna let these dry for a bit, and yeah, we'll see. I'll sand these up to 320 and we'll see what they look like. Alright, that is now has been sanded all the way to 320 and it's looking good. So I didn't find any 400. That would be something that I would use at this point, but I have 600 grit, wet and dry, and I'm going to use it dry. Just to do a quick once over type thing before moving on to the refinishing process. So let's do that now. Now, usually I would use a sanding block, to do everything, but I'm just using 600 grit to quickly go over a little bit. So I'm not that fussed, to be honest, because it's not really going to drastically change any shapes, stuff like that. I have to say that this isn't something you have to do. It's just something that I like to do because I have noticed that the finish just looks and feels so much better after doing this small little addition or small little thing. It's the little things that actually make big differences in the end. There we go, the body is nice and done now. Not too worried about the binding because that's going to get scraped back anyways. A really good way of, in general, a really good way of sanding the sides of the headstock is to have your paper folded twice, so it's in 3 layers, and then just having your fingers running along the edge, because your fingers are making sure that you're putting pressure in the middle right there and not rounding over the edges at all. Because if you do this, then that means your fingers kind of going over a little bit. So I just use the tips of my fingers on the edges of the headstock, and that does exactly what I need it to do. That kind of wraps it up for removing finish off of a guitar. I hope you have enjoyed this little tutorial on how to do things at home. Sure, I mean I did things with an orbital sander at the workshop, but you can easily do that by hand. It's just going to take longer. Things to keep in mind is just go through the grits. If you see any scratches from the previous grit, go back to that previous grit and get rid of them. It's fairly straightforward. See scratches, get rid of them. And wet the grain as many times as you can. Go from there. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, which is literally I'm going to start staining this bad boy. So yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Because refinishing, or actually sanding down all the old, or getting rid of old paint and lacquer, is one of the most requested, is one of the most asked questions on my channel. So I decided to make this tutorial. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. So I think I'm going to make this into somewhat of a series, following along how to finish your guitars in different ways. This one is going to get stained, so that's going to be the next video. And then there's going to be a video on how to do a certain type of method for oiling a guitar, then how to do a DIY lacquer at home for everybody who's trying to do this at home, and how to approach that with spray cans, just normal rattle cans. Yeah, go through all the different stages and see where we end up. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye.